I feel like every year they try to convince me somehow, the retailers that is, that Christmas begins before Thanksgiving. But I am a pretty hardcore person when it comes to the fact that I think that on Black Friday, the holiday season finally begins. And that brings with it so many amazing things. I love Christmas. It's my favorite season. Okay, probably Halloween's my favorite season. That's just because I love the kids dressed up. But after that, it's my favorite season. And who can't love a season that has those decorated, delicious cookies and those beautifully wrapped presents and those marathon movies on television? Those classics like White Christmas and A Christmas Story and Home Alone. That's the one that, quite frankly, I haven't quite gotten yet. If you haven't noticed, they've added Home Alone to the long list of the marathon movies. Now, I don't understand that. And I was raised in the generation with Home Alone, and I still don't understand that. Other than the fact that the movie is supposed to take place over Christmas break, I don't understand how you get that warm, fuzzy holiday feeling from leaving your child in, home when you go to Paris, which is the premise of the movie Home Alone. Now, of course, the closer it gets to season, or the Christmas season, and the more my children begin to ask, I can begin to understand, but I don't think that's quite why they brought it up. Now, I can't really complain, though, because here I am going into the holiday season preaching about a man who's falsely imprisoned under all of these accusations about all these terrible things to do. So I guess really I'm preaching a Lenten season during Christmas, or a Lenten sermon during Christmas. So who knows what I'm going to do during Lent this year. We'll see. It's all up in the air. For those of you who maybe have missed a week or two, you may have missed out on parts of Paul's story. So let me quickly catch you up so that you can understand where we're at today, because we're coming to the end of Acts and things are really beginning to ramp up quickly for Paul. So Paul was on his way to Jerusalem knowing that his final destination was Rome. And so he gets to Jerusalem and he worships in the temple there, and somehow they accuse him of defiling the temple. And so there's this huge accusation, and it gets so violent that actually he is taken away to the governor Felix, and Felix hears his story and decides, rather than to make any kind of an agreement about what should happen to Paul, he decides to not step into the controversy and to leave Paul imprisoned. Paul stays there for 2 years, waiting to have his case heard again. And finally, it's heard by the next governor, whose name is Festus, who's an incredible, upstanding man. And he hears Paul's case when he is on a visit to Jerusalem. And the Jews there come to Festus and tell them all about all these terrible things that Paul has done. He's now, they've included the idea that he's tried to start a rebellion against the Caesar and the governor. And Festus just isn't hearing any of it. And so he agrees to hear Paul's case back in Caesarea. And so they follow him back to Caesarea, and he hears the case, and quite frankly, he doesn't quite know what to do about it. But he's brand new in office, and he doesn't want to irritate an entire group of people so early on in his tenure. And so he tries to make a deal with Paul. He says, Paul, how about I go back to Jerusalem with you, and there I will hear your trial. Well, Paul knows that there is not going to be a fair trial if he's in Jerusalem. So he says no, and he appeals to go see Caesar. And that is where we ended last week, is with Paul appealing to go see Caesar. So he is finally on his way to Rome. This is incredible news for Paul, but it's horrible news for Festus, because Festus had been caught in kind of this interesting situation. You see, Festus could have said no, But if he said no, he would have possibly been accused of overstepping his boundary, the imperial authority that the emperor had. It was a possibility that maybe he would be accused that he was overstepping his bounds. So he had to say yes to Paul, but there was a problem. When you sent a prisoner to Caesar, you had to send them with a letter that said what he was accused of. Well, Festus had heard the case, but quite frankly, he didn't really know what Paul was accused of. He didn't understand Jewish culture well enough to understand what they were saying. So his hands were tied. He didn't really know what to do. But he finally got this lucky break when Agrippa, who's a Roman-appointed Jewish leader, comes in order to welcome him. You see, the Roman government had made it so that you could have a Jewish leader over the Jerusalem. He was called a king, so it was King Agrippa, and it kind of kept the Jews in Jerusalem happy. And so when Agrippa came, here was somebody who was in this incredible position of understanding not just the Roman government, but also the Jewish faith. Festus was like, yes, this is exactly what I've been waiting for. Someone who can hear Paul's case and figure out how I can write this letter to Caesar so I can tell him what he's being accused of. So Festus and Agrippa talk about Paul, and Agrippa's kind of fascinated with the idea of who this Paul guy is. And he says, bring him out, let me hear him. And so Paul comes out and he tells Agrippa his story. He tells Agrippa, I was raised as a Jew. I was a Pharisee. I was the one who persecuted the followers of Jesus. He goes on to tell him about his conversion, about the fact that he saw Jesus himself. And that after that he's gone around and he's been preaching about Jesus. And then Paul shifts his story just slightly. Because he's not really there to talk about his story. He's there to talk about God's story. And that is where we enter into Acts 26 today. So I want to invite you to turn to page 910 in your pew Bibles, where we find this passage where Paul is defending himself before Agrippa. So on page 910, we're going to look at Acts 26, beginning with verses 4 through 8. It's that third paragraph there underneath that heading. So I invite you to follow along as I read. All of the Jews know my way of life from my youth. All a life spent from the beginning among my own people in Jerusalem. They have known for a long time, if they are willing to testify, that I have belonged to the strictest sect of our religion and lived as a Pharisee. And now I stand here on trial on account of my hope in the promise made by God to our ancestors, a promise that our tribes hope to attain as they earnestly worship day and night. It is for this hope, Your Excellency, that I am accused by the Jews. Why is it thought incredible by any of you that God raises the dead? And now Paul tells of his preaching. If you want to continue reading with me, verses 22 and 23 on the next page. To this day I have had help from God. And so I stand here testifying to both small and great, saying nothing but what comes from the prophets and Moses said would take place, that the Messiah must suffer, and that by being the first to raise from the dead, he would proclaim light to both our people and to the Gentiles. So here Paul is making his argument, and he makes this connection back to the prophets. We oftentimes think about the prophets during this holiday season, right? That they're the ones who proclaimed the coming of the Messiah. Well, the Jews point back to those same exact prophets in order to talk about the Messiah, the one who would come to save. And so what Paul is doing is he's laying this foundation for us today and for Agrippa and Festus then, that this belief in Jesus is founded on who the promise of the Messiah, who was proclaimed by those same prophets that both Jews and Gentiles, both Jews and Christians point back to. And so after laying that foundation, though, Paul begins to talk about the major differences between their faith. Because while Jews would say, yes, there is a Messiah, what Paul mentions here is that we as Christians look back and understand that not only do those passages talk about the coming Messiah, but that Messiah will be one who suffers. Now, Jews in that day and Jews today do not believe that that's the case. This is where Judaism and Christianity separate ways. While we look at those prophets and say, look at the ways that they proclaimed that it must be a suffering servant who comes to save, they don't see that. And so Paul is proclaiming something new. And then he goes back into something that Jews believe, and that is this understanding of the resurrection. Did you know that the resurrection was a Jewish belief? Well, that is. And so he talks about Jesus is then the first one to be resurrected. He lays down the foundation for Festus and Agrippa to understand who Jesus is. But the problem is, Festus doesn't have all that background, does he? He's a Roman. He's a pagan. He doesn't understand all of that story. And so when he hears Paul proclaiming these truths to him, what he does in the very next verse is he looks at him and says, "You're mad, Paul. Crazy." And this was a pretty typical response by a Roman-educated individual, to call someone mad who said something that was outside of their realm of thinking. Well, Paul is Paul. He doesn't really let that faze him too much. Instead, he sets his sights on Agrippa. Agrippa's a Jew. He has all the background he needs to understand exactly what Paul has said. And that's exactly what he's going to say as we continue on with our reading for today. Verses 26 through 29, where Paul addresses Agrippa directly. "Indeed, the king knows about these things, and to him I speak freely, for I am certain that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this was not done in a corner. King Agrippa, do you believe in the prophets? I know that you believe." Agrippa said to Paul, "Are you so quickly persuading me to become a Christian?" Paul replied, "Whether quickly or not, I pray to God that not only you, but also all who are listening to me today might become such as I am, except for these chains." So Paul has this conversation with Agrippa, and he starts off by talking about, again, the prophets, whom Agrippa had a full understanding of. And so when he begins this dialogue with Agrippa, Agrippa tries to kind of sidestep what Paul is asking. What he does is he kind of goes, "Hey, come on, Paul, what are you trying to do? Make me a Christian?" And Paul's like, "Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to do right here and right now." And he goes on to talk then about the fact that this is what he wants from them. Now, what's interesting is both Agrippa and Festus, if you continue to read the story, they kind of miss that. And they step off to the side and they have a conversation with one another, and they come to this agreement. And the agreement is this, that actually there's not a good case against Paul. That if he hadn't appealed to the emperor, they probably would set him free. But Paul has appealed to the emperor, and Festus can't go back on his word. And so Paul has to go to the emperor. And so what we find kind of as this chapter ends is Agrippa and Festus going, "Poor Paul. If Paul had only been a wiser man, perhaps maybe he wouldn't be in this situation." And they send him off to Caesar. And they still don't get it. They still don't understand that they think that they've been in control this whole time. And here's Paul pulling the strings. You see, Paul didn't really want to get out of jail. I don't think he did. I don't think Paul cared about what Festus or Agrippa were going to do. Paul knew he was on his way to Rome. And on the way, he was using the platform that he had been given in order to preach the message of Jesus to anybody and everybody who would listen. And if you think back to what we talked about a couple weeks ago in Philippians, where Paul is talking about the fact that he's been imprisoned and he's seeing these incredible things happen in the Christian faith while he's been imprisoned. that the faith is growing. The gospel is spreading like wildfire. And he's talking about how amazing that is. And all of that is possible because he's been imprisoned. And everywhere he goes, he's preaching the message of Jesus. You know, in actuality, Paul's story fits really well into this holiday season. Because Paul's story is simply a story about a man being faithful to this cry that we've been given, this commandment that we've been given to go and preach the good news of Jesus. And I think Paul simply does that by using the opportunities that have been given to him. If Paul's imprisoned, he'll preach to everybody in prison. If Paul's given the opportunity to talk to kings, he talks to kings. That's what God has sent him to do. And that's exactly what he's going to do. You know, I've met with a lot of people who, when we talk about what it means to be a Christian, they're all on board in most cases until you get to this idea that you and I are called to preach the message of Jesus. And that tends to be where I would say probably a majority of people who I've talked to go, that's the place where I get a little nervous. I get a little nervous about preaching about Jesus and talking about Jesus. And we think about all the ways that we have to do that. And yet I think sometimes we're given those opportunities and we just don't take them. And one of those opportunities for me is an entire season of Christmas. Christmas to me is a season where the door is open to talk about Jesus. It can be as simple as talking to one of your coworkers or friends about your holiday traditions. Because for a lot of us, our holiday traditions, just like Paul's beliefs were so steeped in his Jewish tradition, our holiday traditions are steeped in our Christian faith. Sometimes just sharing your traditions is an opportunity to talk about Jesus. Sometimes it's doing things like the sharing tree, which many of us have already participated in, is being the hands and feet of Jesus in this season. You know, I wonder if together this morning, you and I could pray about an opportunity to simply step into the Christmas season with eyes that are open and to ask the question, do they really know it's Christmas? Do they really know about Jesus' birthday? And is there a way that just naturally, not going out of your way, but just naturally taking the opportunities given to you, you can share about Jesus during a season that's actually, as Tyler reminded us, about Jesus? Let's not be a people who let the parade pass by. Let's be a people whose eyes are open for the opportunity. And if you don't get one this Advent season, that's fine. But what would happen if each of us just prayed for one and waited with anticipation this season for an opportunity to share with someone else the good news that the Messiah, the long-expected Jesus, has come? Let us proclaim that truth this season. Would you pray with me? Gracious Lord, you who are our Creator, who are our Messiah, and who is the one who goes before us and prepares hearts, Lord, we pray that you would be all of those things for us during this season. Lord, I pray that you would give us opportunities to simply share a little bit about who you are with those around us. Lord, may it, even if it's a stranger in the grocery store, if it's a friend or a loved one, Lord, may you open those doors for us. That as we anticipate your coming, that we also anticipate your faithfulness, Lord, in answering our prayers. That perhaps, Lord, there would be one more to worship with us your coming this holiday season. We ask this in your most precious name. Amen.